Hmm. Welcome to today's episode. Hello, and welcome to today's episode of Creatio Tech Hour. My name is Kirill, and today we're going to be spending some time talking about Git. We're going to talk about how Git can help us with organizing and structuring our code, how we can use Git to save and store information in the local and the remote databases, and we'll take a look at some of the things that we need to take care of in Creatio. For the purpose of this presentation, I haven't been preparing many slides as I intend on jumping straight into a couple of examples just to simplify understanding of what Git can do for us. So let me show you my screen. On my screen right now, you're seeing a brand new installation of Creatio product. This is the latest release, I believe 17.3, build 1377. It doesn't matter what the build is. What's important is that it's the latest release, and we're going to be exploring some of the features that some of the features of this release and trying to work with Git to make sure that we can store information locally and in the remote repository. So first thing first, what is Git? Git is nothing more than a version control system. It's a sophisticated version control system. However, the main purpose of Git is to make sure that we can control a version of your file system. Now, Git only works with the content on your hard drive, on your disk. So be it a disk C, or if you're on Mac or Linux, perhaps in some other structure. But at the end of the day, there has to be a directory or a folder that Git is responsible for monitoring. If there is no folder, there is nothing Git can do for us. And that brings me to the first point. If you're trying to employ Git to work with Creatio deployed in the cloud, you're probably not going to have a great amount of success. And that's simply because you do not have access to a file system. The only time that Git can help us is when we have access to a local file system. So in order for us to get files in our local environment, we need to do a couple of things. The first thing we need to do is we need to take our brand new installation of Creatio and we need to convert it into what's known a development in file system mode. Now, to convert our creation to file system mode is fairly straightforward. All we have to do is change a couple of configuration settings, and that's exactly what we're going to do now. Before we jump any further, I want to go into backend into configuration. For that, I will press this button. Now, some of you may know that this button is available when you enable debug mode, and the debug mode is enabled for me right now. You could tell that here under the sign of Creatio, it says debug, and so this button is available. If this button is not available, just go into your system settings, and I'll show you how you can do this. So let's search for system settings real quick. And in system settings, just search for debug. Okay, so that the setting is called debug. So let's search for debug. And in my case, this debug mode is enabled, and you can enable it quite easily just by enabling this checkbox. And once this checkbox is enabled, you can just simply click on this button and it will open the backend. Now, what we're seeing in the backend is quite normal and straightforward, and this is the first time that I'm actually going here, so it might take a little longer. Plus, my machine is now streaming onto the YouTube, so it's taking a little bit of a resources out. So what we're seeing here is just a normal list of content on the left-hand side, and some schemas on the right-hand side, and there is nothing specific about this application. However, if we go under Actions, you see that there are two options: download packages to file system and update packages from file system. These two options are currently unavailable to me, as I have not told my system to operate in such mode. In order for me to make those instructions, I need to configure a web config file located inside the directory where the application is installed. Let's go inside that directory and take a look. So I'm going to open my drive, and I'm going to go into where I've installed the app. It's called EP3. And in here, I'm going to look for this file, web config. I'm just going to open it. And inside this file, I need to find changes, and I know where they're located, and I'll point that out to you. And the first one is going to be in line around 419. There we go, file design mode. By default, when you're installing the application, this configuration is configured to false. So everything that is stored in the product is stored in the database, all your schemas, all your files. And you can take a look at the content of those files inside the database if you query tables such as sysschema or sysschema source. There are a couple of tables that will allow you to take a look at what's currently recorded in the database. Now, this is the first thing that I want to change. I want to change it from false to true. Let me just change it here. Perfect. And then the second setting is going to be around line 469, use static file content. And all we have to do here is we have to change it from true to false. That's all that is required of us. So two settings: use static file content, we change it to false, and enable design mode, file design mode, we change it to true. Now, in my case, these are lines 419 and line 469, I believe. But if you're installing a product such as, for example, enterprise, sales enterprise, marketing, or service, or any combination of thereof, obviously these lines will be a little bit different, as there may be more settings inside this web config. So just look for them by name. There's also an article on the Academy. I can now close this file, and there is nothing I need to do with this file any longer. Let's go back into our browser. I will close this, and I will go back into my configuration one more time. And just give it a moment. First time we load. So now, hopefully, when everything loads and we are not seeing any significant difference here, with the exception of we now see these two items enabled. So what we did in web config file, we've instructed our system to operate in a way that everything now is to be stored in the file system. So let's go back into our file system and take a look where these things might be stored. We're going to go into Terrasoft Web App. Inside there, we're going to go into Terrasoft configuration, and we're going to look at the structure of this directory. There is a pkg directory that contains some packages here, and I'll explain what they are a little later. And there is auto-generated folder that contains src folder that contains, at this moment, absolutely nothing. Now, this src folder will be populated once we instruct the system to download packages to file system. So let's execute this option and click on download packages to file system. When we do that, the system will think for a little bit, and the content of this directory will be populated with some items. It might take a while, depending on how fast your machine is. In my case, I expect it to take about 10 to 15 seconds. I also expect about 6,000 files or maybe more. You could tell that now it's 7,000 or 9,000, so quite a lot of files. I was expecting just 6, but now it's quite a lot more. Okay, and what these files essentially are, it's the content of your entire package structure. And if you've attended any trainings that is provided by Creatio or by the Academy, you would probably hear us say that let's take a look at some of the examples that are located inside this auto-generated folder. This auto-generated folder is exactly that. It's the folder containing all the schemas that are currently created in your Creatio installation. So you can find anything, let's say, from the package base, and if we click on base, and we'll see a bunch of schemas here, we'll be able to find it inside of our auto-generated folder. Now, our folder contains files such as JavaScript, C#, and then a couple of other ones, so things like CSS, etc. So we can order it by type just to kind of quickly see it. But what I have done is I've added the content of this directory simply into my Visual Studio Code into this workspace. Now, the reason I did this, and the way I did this, is just by simply going to File and say Add Folder to Workspace, and then I can have multiple folders here. So I've got folder for our packages, okay, and I have folders for my auto-generated content. Inside this auto-generated content, it's quite easy for me to just simply search for something. So for example, I want to be searching for some HTTP, and maybe I will find some files that I'm looking for. So it's very easy and convenient way searching and navigating content of your directory. Okay. And so now that we have downloaded everything into a file or onto disk, what's next? Well, what's next is to actually tell the system to utilize those files. As of right now, there's a lot of backend code that is happening, and the runtime needs to load some of that backend code. So what we want to do is we want to make sure that whatever is on the disk right now is being actually utilized. In order for us to achieve that, we have to click on the compile. Now, at this point, because we have previously configured our web config file to utilize content from the disk, system will no longer be going to the database to acquire these classes, and it will just simply build Terrasoft configuration with the source that is currently available on disk. So this will take a little bit, maybe a minute or so, as any compilation does. And once the compilation is completed, we can just simply close this part and move on and do whatever the customizations to our system that we need. Now, there are a couple advantages of operating in the file system mode. One such big advantage is that you can start utilizing source code designer or editor of your choice. So you could be using, let's say, a Visual Studio Code, or you could be using a Visual Studio proper to write your code, be it a JavaScript or CSS or whatever it is that you're developing at this time. Now, in my case, operation was successful. And the second major advantage that you have when you're converting to file system mode is access to the thread that is actually running the application. That means that you can open the Visual Studio and you can attach to a currently running instance of a application pool if you're on Windows, and you can debug. And that's very invaluable when you're trying to develop some new application. So this is just a couple of advantages that you may realize when you're converting your system into file system mode. Okay, so now that the system is configured and now the system is has been compiled, what we may need to do is we may need to get out of here and come back in and just make sure that everything is up and running. So I'll close this tab as well. And we're going to try to re-log in just to assure smooth operations. By the way, if you guys have any questions, please don't hesitate to write them in the YouTube chat. It would really help us make this content a little bit more interactive. So please go ahead and type it away, and I'll try to answer if I have an answer. All right. So we have Now we're logging back into our system, and now we're operating in the file in the design mode, in development in the file system mode. Okay, perfect. So what can we do here, and how is Git coming into play? Well, like I said, Git is nothing more than just a tool that allows us to keep track of content on disk. So be it a collection of text files or directories or libraries or things like that. Git can simply keep track of those and tell us, okay, well, something has changed, and if change is observed, then we can perhaps propagate that change to a remote repository in one way or the other. Git allows us to move back and forth between the changes, so we can always revert back to the last known, let's say, version that we were happy with, or we can perhaps use Git to implement branching and some other advanced features that today we're not prepared to discover, but Git allows us quite a lot. And the idea for today is just to take a look at the most basic use case for Git, and this is initializing a repository and perhaps pushing it onto a public website that is capable of accepting our repositories. Now, there are a couple out there, and the best known ones are going to be GitHub and GitLab. And those are two that allow you to create free account and allow you to publish code online privately or publicly, depending on your subscription level. And most of the repositories, if you're working for the organization, you will either have an account there, or if not, then you can still create an organization. You can still have limited amount of people contributing to it without having to make it public. Okay, but that has nothing to do with Git, nothing to do with Creatio. It has to do with the remote repository hosting service. In today's example, we will be using a GitHub, but in a very similar fashion, you can use GitLab, and the licensing agreement is slightly different between them. Okay, good. So the first thing that I want to do is when I'm starting my customization is I always want to go and create my own packages, right? So my own packages where I am going to encapsulate all my logic, all my data, and this is essentially what's going to be transferred from my development machine onto pre-production and then eventually on the production to the client. Okay, so creating a package is a straightforward operation. We just simply go into our backend and we say that let's create a package here. Okay, so we can create a package this way. But because we're already working in the file system mode, I don't quite want to create packages here. And the reason I don't want to create package here is because I want to utilize Clio to help me out. Now, Clio is the more newer and modern way of creating your applications or additions to Creatio, and it gives us a couple of flexibilities and options, and it just provides for perhaps a nicer developer experience. So I'm going to be consuming Clio to do exactly this. Now, in order for me to use Clio, I'll go back into my Visual Studio and bring up my terminal. Now, once I'm inside the terminal, what I need to do is I need to go, well, I'm already inside Terrasoft configuration PKG folder. So if we look at this folder, we'll see where we are. And what I want to do is I want to create my new package. Now, it turns out that it's very easy to do, and all I need to do is just to say Clio init. Now, if you don't have Clio installed, just make sure that you install it. And the installation is very straightforward. You can just simply say .net tool install Clio and -G for global. And my tool is already installed. So what I can do is instead of installing it, I can first uninstall it. Perfect. And then I can come back and I can reinstall it. Now, there's also an update command that will allow you to update your Clio. Okay, so Clio is installed. Now, let's go ahead and create our package. So I'm going to say Clio init, and I'm going to provide a name. I'm going to say, let me actually call it episode 3, right? As this is our third online episode, I'm going to call it episode 3. And all I have to do is just simply hit enter. Now, in this case, what's happening here is inside PKG folder, I now have, let's go take a look actually at what was created for us. And I can close my terminal now. And what I'm interested in is what's happening in here inside PKG folder. And if I search, I should be able to find my episode 3. Perfect. Here's my episode 3. And inside my episode 3, I have a bunch of folders that you might be familiar with, things like assemblies, data, files, and essentially they're all empty at this point. Now there are some placeholders, just an empty file. You can remove them if you want, but I'm not going to bother. So just a bunch of simple stuff, okay? All right. Now, the next thing that we need to do when we're creating a package is we need to talk about this descriptor file. So inside our episode 3, inside of our package, we will have what's called a descriptor file. And this descriptor file will tell the system that this is a package and the system needs to be aware of it. Okay, so quite a few examples of a descriptor file you can find inside a custom package. Now, our custom package is totally empty, but every package will contain a descriptor. Now, you might know that descriptor defines, or a custom package defines its dependency, and it depends on everything, on every other package. There is an explicit dependency listed in the application. Let's quickly take a look at this dependency. So if we go under custom package and we say actions, package dependency diagram, you will see that once the system builds that, everything kind of connects into custom. And the way you express this dependency is simply through this descriptor JSON. So every single package that exists will be listed here as my dependency. Now, the package that I want to use for my dependency for today's demonstration is going to be called product core. Product core. Now, there are a couple of ones that the search will pick up. But what I want to do is I want to just simply use this product core, and I'm going to grab this file just like that, and I'm going to put it inside my descriptor. Okay, so I'm just going to do it this way. Okay, at this point, my dependency is configured, and I can now go back into my application and tell the system to go and upload files from file system. So I haven't done anything yet. I haven't built anything. I haven't compiled anything as far as the file system concerned. All I'm doing is I'm just simply creating a package. Now, inside this descriptor, I also have a couple of other options, such as description. I can provide some description here, and I can specify something. I can write that this is episode 3, or package for episode 3. Let's call it package episode. Geez, I can't spell. Let's say package for episode 3. Okay, so this is what I'm going to do here, and I'm going to simply save this. Now, if I wanted to build more stuff, I would open it now with Visual Studio, open this episode 3 solution, update my repository, and do all that stuff. But what I'm interested in right now is showing you what and how system actually interacts with the file system content rather than building some logic. So today we're not going to be building a lot of stuff. We're just going to be creating some mocks of our work. So we're going to create a section or a business process just so that you understand how and where all this file system stuff gets stored and how Git can help us with it. Okay, so now that I've created my descriptor, what I want to do is I want to go back into the system, and here's my diagram finally loaded, and we can explore this diagram just by zooming out perhaps here a little bit, and you will see that the custom packages, and I apologize for such small view right now, but there's no other way to put it all on the screen. So the custom package is essentially here all the way at the bottom, and it depends on everything, and my system is quite slow, but nonetheless, it connects to everything, so perhaps you'll have better luck on your machine. And that's why we were able to find all those descriptor properties describing all these dependencies. Okay? So let's get out of here, and let's do one action here. So in my actions, I want to go and create update packages from file system. Now, what this will instruct system to do is to go through the content of our application, okay? And inside the content of our application, go and grab things that are new, that the system is not aware of. Now, there's nothing else we need to do. It just compares to what it knew to what the current status of the file system is. And if there is any difference, it will pick up that difference and hopefully inform us of its findings. So let's give it a moment, as my machine is definitely struggling with the workload right now. And in the meantime, what we can do is, oh, there we go. So system's indicating that it found episode 3 as a package, and it found some files in the package. Now at this point, we don't really need to create. We don't need to look at these files as we haven't built anything, and the clear packages are meant to create backend assembly, so your C# basically classes that go into an assembly, and we haven't really created any, so we don't need to worry about building anything. But what we want to do now is, now that the package is here, we want to initialize a repository that we will be able to use to commit files and changes to the repository, and then eventually we want to connect it to a remote storage facility such as GitHub to make sure that our package is available for perhaps our team consumption. Okay, so how do I do that? So I can see that here's my episode 3, and just to make sure that we didn't make any mistake, let's quickly take a look at the properties. Now the properties of the package, as you could see, product core, the dependency that we have specified, and here's the description that I have typed in the file system. So this should be a proof enough for you to know that, yes, everything that is happening in the file system can be uploaded into the application, and everything that is inside the application can essentially be offloaded and downloaded into our file system. Now, once we know that that's possible, now we can say, okay, well, if I can get the content of my application or content of my package into my file system, that means that using Git is also possible, because Git will watch the content of this directory and it will do whatever we instruct Git to do at this point. Okay, so I'm not intending on doing anything else with the Git, and what we're going to do now is, now we're going to go and initialize a repository. Now, what you need to do before you do any Git initialization is to make sure that you actually have Git installed. Now, to install Git, you just Google or use your favorite search to search for Git download for Windows, and you will find a website like git-scm.com, and it will tell you a great thing about Git and give you multiple options to download for Linux, for Mac, for Windows. I already have Git installed, and I also have installed a couple of plugins for my Visual Studio Code as well as for Visual Studio, just to make the workflow a little bit easier. I'm not going to go through installation. It's fairly straightforward. Just agree to licensing and click next, and you will have your Git install. Okay, so let's go back into our Visual Studio. Or before we actually go there, let me show you what you're going to get once you download your package. Not package, once you install Git. So let's go back to our episode 3. Let's go back to web app. Let's go back to configuration, packaging, and find our episode 3. Perfect. So here's my package. Now, after having installed Git, you will have a couple of additional options available to you once you right-click anywhere in the Explorer. And one such option is going to be Git GUI here or Git bash here. Now, if you do a Git bash here, all you're going to get is essentially a bash or a command prompt, from Git. So all the Git commands are already loaded, and you can ask for things for Git to do stuff. For example, you can ask for -- version just to make sure that you're running the latest version. So in my case, I'm running version 231, and this happens to be the latest at the time of this recording. Okay. So what I want to do also is, I don't want to be using multiple command prompts. I want to be using my Visual Studio Code. And I absolutely don't have to open Git bash. I can just open my regular command prompt. If you fancy that one, you can do that. Or you can just use your Visual Studio Code to help you with this. So again, I'm going to go to command prompt here. And since I'm sitting here inside PKG, I now want to initialize a repository. Now, there are multiple approaches to how we're going to be initializing a repository. Now, let's talk about some of them. I can go inside my episode 3, so I can say cd episode 3, and if here I'm looking at my files, and perhaps everything that I create, I can initialize just this episode 3 as my Git repository. Now, it might also happen that as you're developing, and you might need to have multiple packages or multiple directories that you would like to be part of one package. For example, one obvious example is when you're developing with Clio, it's quite often to request functions defined inside TerraSoft configuration. And the only way for you to achieve that is through the help of interfaces. You create another package there, and we're not going to go into details, but you create another package for just for interfaces, and hence you need another directory. So what else can we do? Well, we can create a directory, or we can initialize a directory right here inside PKG. So let's go ahead and instead of initializing a Git repository from episode 3 from inside this folder, let's go one level up and let's initialize our Git repository here. So I'm going to say Git init. Okay, that's my first command. And when I do Git init, I am initializing a repository, and you could see that I have initialized some stuff here. Now, as soon as I initialize my stuff, look at the counter of my Git. Now, it was 2. Let's not talk about why, but now I have 237 or an indicator indicating 237 items. Now, if I switch to this item, and these are changes from just some other packages that we don't need to worry about right now, okay? So let's just not worry about it. That's why it's here. But the changes that we're looking at are right here related to our package, 235 of them. And let me see if I can close this clone. No, let's just not worry. Just pretend that those first 2 lines aren't here. Okay, so I've got changes here, and if we look at the changes and the file locations, and you just hover over, and the reason I'm using Visual Studio Code is just because it's such a great editor. It tells me everything that I need to know about the files and tells me everything I want to know about their content, and I can connect Git and things of that nature. Okay, so it's telling me that it's inside my EP3, it's inside TerraSoft configuration, PKG, analytics, definitely not my package. And yet, because we have initialized it from PKG folder, all the content found in those PKG directories, so essentially everything that is found inside this folder is now part of my repository. Now, this is definitely not the way I want to go about it, because I have nothing to do with these other directories. They're provided to me with the installation of Creatio, and I had nothing to do with them, so I'm not intending on committing them to my repository. The only thing that I'm intending on committing is episode 3 and perhaps another directory called episode 3 interfaces, or maybe something that I have created. So how can I use Git to help me out with this? Well, it turns out that Git has a very efficient tool, and it's called a Git Ignore file. Now, a Git Ignore file is a file that you place inside the directory that you are currently observing. And I happen to have one. And the one that I'm going to use is going to be based on the work, or based on the contributions by community. And if you go on the GitHub, you can simply search for Git Ignore. Okay, so if you go on the GitHub in this text box, just type in Git Ignore and search for a Git Ignore for Visual Studio. Okay, and here's the file. Here's my Visual Studio Git Ignore file. And if I click on it, I will see something like this. Now, I can't really download it like this. I can just download perhaps if I go into raw. So if you click on raw, here's the file. And all I need to do is I just simply need to copy the URL. And once I copy the URL, I can go back into my Visual Studio. And now inside the Visual Studio, let's do this. Depending on whether or not you have this command installed, you need to essentially download this file. So what we can do is we can either copy the content of the file and create a new file here, or we can do something like wget, paste this thing, and let's say -o for output, and we're going to save it into a file called Git Ignore. Okay, and we're currently in PKG directory, so this is what I want to do. Now my Git Ignore is now saved, okay, and I can see that here's my Git Ignore file, and I can simply just open it up. Okay, so you could have just created the file here straight in the directory and copied the content of this directory. Okay, perfect. So Git Ignore is telling us things not to include in our Git repository, and just read the documentation how Git Ignore files get formed, but essentially you're specifying things not to be included. So for Visual Studio, you're not going to include things like obj directory, right? You don't want that because you regenerate this directory every time. And you could see an example how, let's say, obj directory is going to be excluded. Okay, let's go all the way down to the bottom of our file and let's create a couple of our rules. Now we still see that we have a ton of rules here or a ton of directories that are included. And the reason I know it's included because Visual Studio indicates what's included with the help of this green dot. Okay, so green dot means that it's added, and if I were to commit it, I would have committed 216 folders. And so let me try this. Let me add a word base all the way at the bottom. And the reason I'm using base is because base is the shortest name for our package here. Okay, so all I'm going to do is just not beat plus, just base, thank you. And I'm going to save it. So make sure that your Visual Studio saves the file. So, and as soon as we save it, you could see that base goes gray, and that means that the base is now excluded. So what I need to do now is I need to essentially copy the content of all the directories that I would like to exclude. And I have done that already once. So I'm going to go onto my Git Ignore directory, and I'm going to open this Git Ignore and just copy its content, okay? And the only difference between what I'm copying now and what you saw is essentially this stuff, okay? Now I see that I have created this for a studio package. And in my case, I'm using not a studio package, but I'm using an enterprise package. So I need to add a couple of additional ones. So campaign designer, case service, etc. And so let's go ahead and do this. Campaign designer, and then we have case service. So that should take care of these two. Now we need core forecast. So this will take care of this guy, unless I misspelled it. Yes, I did. Forecast, perfect. Now we want to keep episode 3, but what we want to do is we want to, let's say, do this. It was campaign designer, now it's going to be marketing campaign, and we want service model, and we have tracking, I believe, and that should take care of everything. Okay, except for its marketing campaign, actually, not designer. So let's fix that real quick. Okay. All right, so now I see that I have only one directory that is being tracked, and now this is just a directory for my episode 3. Okay, so what can I do and how can I commit it somewhere, and how can I actually publish this content out on the internet? So the easiest way, and not the easiest way, but the way for us to do this is to use a command git.add. Now, we can add one directory or one file, but what essentially we can use a IDE such as a Visual Studio or Visual Studio Code to help us, excuse me, to help us out with this. And so let's go and take a look at this directory here. So what we can do here is we can say Control P to execute a command, and we can say git commit. Oops. Control Shift P, sorry, git commit. Okay, and we can say commit all or commit, and just read at some documentation on the plugin what it is. But in my case, I'm just going to say commit all. Okay, and now it's going to ask me which package to commit. And the reason it's asking me this is because I have multiple packages that I need to commit here. Okay, so let me just actually finish this. To be honest, don't remember what was done with them. So I just want to get rid of this, and I'll explain what I'm doing. Let me just get rid of this stuff. So the old commands can go away. Okay, so this should take care of it. Yes, come on. 1, 2. Oops. And git commit all. empty commit. All right. In any case, so what I've done right now is I have committed everything to this repository. So when you're committing something to a repository, we are essentially saying that, okay, we've got a repository and we need to push it from a disk to a repository so it's being tracked. Now, you might be wondering where and how this whole thing is being tracked. Now, we've created this directory inside the PKG folder, and we've placed our Git Ignore file here. Now, we also have this new directory. When we created Git init, we created this, or Git for us created this .git directory, and everything that we do essentially gets committed here. Now, Git has a very efficient structure of remembering what's being changed, and so entire repository right now sits right here inside this directory. Now we can take this directory, this .git directory, we can move it around, and that will represent the entire directory. Now what we want to do, though, is a little bit different. What we want to do now is we want to go to GitHub, let's say, and I will go under my name, and I'm going to create a new repository. Or actually, let me go under episode, under Academy. And in here, we're going to create a new repository. I'm going to give it a name, episode 3, and for now I'm going to keep it private, or actually let's keep it public, and let's create this repository. I'm not going to initialize with anything Git Ignore, and as soon as I do this, Git is telling me that, hey, go ahead and initialize a new repository, which we already did. We just did that a second ago. We also did this Git Add when in Visual Studio we executed commit all, and what we want to do is now we want to say, okay, I would like to do it in the main branch, and I would like to add this origin, right? So here's my next command that I want to use, and I'm going to just simply copy this command, go back into my Visual Studio, and say that inside this directory, okay, so inside this directory, I want to execute this git remote add origin. And that will basically tell Git where and how we're going to be pushing this stuff, okay? So where it needs to push this stuff. And what you want to do next is you want to do maybe a Git branch main, if that's what you want to do. And so let's say we're going to say that, and that essentially says that we're working in the main branch. And what we now want to do is to do a final step, and that's going to be git push -u origin and the branch that we're currently in. Now, Visual Studio is helping us. If you look here, it will tell us the branch that you're in. So it's essentially telling us that you're inside the main branch. Now, the other thing that Visual Studio is also telling us with the help of a plugin is that there is one, you see this number 1, and it's telling us that we need to execute a push. So we need to do at least one push to update the content of this directory or content of our repository up to the remote origin, or in our case, it's going to be a GitHub. Now we can execute this command, git push -u origin main, or we can just simply use Visual Studio help. So I'm going to use Visual Studio by saying git push. Okay, so when I do git push, you could tell in the left corner that the wheel is spinning, and now I should be committed, and I should have transferred all my files onto my remote origin. So let's take a look. I'm going to hit F5 here, and if things worked out, let's take a look. Things didn't work out for me, okay? Why? Let's take a look. Really strange. And let's try it this way. Okay, so my Visual Studio is not helping me at this point, but it will once the old stuff from my Visual Studio is going to go away. Anyway, so what we're seeing here is that we have our first commit. Now here I'm seeing that I've only committed something once. Okay, so here's my one commit, And my commit is verified just because I've added the GPG key. And again, if you're interested, just Google how to do it. And GitHub has its own instructions, whereas GitLab has its own instruction. Okay. So we have one commit, and inside this one commit, we can take a look at what's inside this commit. We can click on the verified, or we can just essentially click on the commit itself and take a look at the content of the files. So here's my Git Ignore file, and it's going to offer us essentially a story, right? So what was added, how things were added, and you could probably recognize some of the files. Here's our descriptor, etc., etc. Okay, so now we know how to push things onto GitHub, or essentially onto some remote repository. And what I want to do now is I want to show you how and where, for example, provide maybe some additional documentation. So how do we go about creating things? And the easiest thing that we can do is we can just simply, being inside the PKG folder, what we can do is we can create a new file. Let's create a new file and call it readme.md. Okay, and this is just a naming convention that GitHub will use in order to produce this file or do something with this file in a way that GitHub understands. Okay, so that's just essentially how GitHub works. Now, as soon as I created the file, you could see an indicator that I now have a new file here, and here's my readme MD inside this PKG. So if I go back into my content now, right? So inside my content and I look inside my file, I can write things here. So what can I write? I'm going to say that this is documentation for episode 3. Okay, and Visual Studio provides a bunch of plugins and essential and extensions that allow you to preview what the README file would look like. So in this case, I'm going to click on this README preview, and I can see it with this plugin, or I can see it with this one, or I can see it with some other ones. It doesn't matter. There's a lot of them, and you can structure it in many ways, and one will work a little better than the other. Nothing is perfect, but nonetheless, you can preview these changes. You can make things bold, okay? You can make lists here. So let's say item 1, item 2, etc. Okay, so you can do things like this. You can provide links, and this is in general a great place for you to write documentation. So let's say that I've written my documentation and I am now ready to save it. Now, saving it locally is not going to help me. I need to somehow clean up this README PKG. What you will see inside this change, right? So inside this PKG thing, you can click on this icon. Okay, so you can click on the commit, and when you click on the commit, a message is expected. A message is something that tells you and others who are using your repository what this commit is all about. A commit is a finished unit of work. So just simply describe this commit in one sentence or so. So in my case, I'm going to say added readme.md, even though it's so simple. So I'm going to hit enter, and I'm going to read this MD. Now you could tell that there is one update that needs to go, so we can click on the update, right? And here's my spinny wheel, and now it's turning. And if I go back into my repository on GitHub on episode 3, you could see that now there is a readme MD, and here is a line for the message that I've written. You can also see that there are 2 commits now. So commit 2, 29 seconds ago, and if we click on the commit 2, you can search what this commit is all about, and here's the content of the file. Green line represents addition, and a red line represents subtraction. GitHub is just a nice user interface that allows you at this point easy navigation between various files, right? So between the commits, because navigating with the command line may be a little bit overwhelming in the beginning. So why not start with the nice UI? Okay, so on this commit, the other features offered by GitHub and GitLab is to provide some additional comments. So what we've done here is added a README file, let's say by me. That was great. But imagine if you had a team working. You as the team member who is allowed to contribute into this project would be able to leave a comment, for example, discussing the code, rather than having a formal pull request. And in this case, we're not discussing teamwork. We're just talking about individual work. But what you'd be able to do here is essentially to write comments for your team members discussing whatever the things that you're writing. Okay, enough of that. So now that we know how to create files and now we're confident that all changes are being dropped here, what else can we do? Well, let's go and do something inside Creatio. So I'm going to jump back into my my Creatio installation here, and I'm going to go and create, let's say, a new section. Now, creating a new section is something that you do all the time when you're starting a new package. So why don't we try that? Let's go and say that we're going to go to section wizard. There we go, section wizard. And let's create a demo section. It doesn't matter what the content of our section. What matters is that we are just creating something, and we want to see how this content gets committed down onto your disk. All right, so we are in the section wizard, and I'm going to call it episode 3, and episode 3 is the name, and I'm just going to drop it into some workplace. Let's put it into Studio for now, and let's go and set up some pages while we're at it. And that will inevitably take some time, but this should be a familiar process for any developer. Okay, and I'm going to get out back from this section. So the page and the source code for the page has now been generated. So we can go out and we can just simply click save. And again, I am using USR for my index just because I didn't bother changing it. So let's save this. And let's go back into Visual Studio and let's start observing the changes that are hopefully going to be propagated down onto our disk. Okay, so I'm going to close all this README files as I don't want that to take any space. And I'm going to make this a little bit wider. And we could see that something is happening. So system is doing something, but no files have yet been generated. So we're still sitting here saving object names or schemas. So the system is still generating a chunk of stuff that it's going to save on disk. But when the save operation is completed, that's when we're going to see the result. And it's still doing it. Hopefully not much longer. Meantime, guys, if you have any questions, please do answer. Please do ask in live chat, and I will be able to answer, hopefully, the ones that you have. Okay, changes applied successfully. Very good. Let's jump into. And we're seeing nothing here. Okay, so what we may need to do is we may need to give it a bit of a push. So let's jump into our backend. Okay, and in our backend, oh, you know what? I forgot to include, of course, that's what I did. I forgot to change the package from custom package to our package. So that's okay. We can fix that in this version. So everything that we've done essentially is gotten added to this package, to my custom package. And that's my mistake. I apologize for that. So let's take a look at what was added inside the custom package. So I could see that some data was, some resources were added, some schemas were added, etc. Okay, so the way we fix this is just simply select everything and go under actions, okay, and say move to another package. And this move to another package, the only one to choose from is episode 3. And so now you can, if you make this mistake, you can always move it to a new package. Now, this is a feature offered in the latest release of our product, so please do use this. It's very useful. And in some cases, you'll see that, okay, well, it doesn't know how to resolve it. So that's okay for us. We will just move it anyway. Okay, so what we're interested now is I'm interested in what's happening inside my episode 3, and I want to somehow commit the changes. Now, once the changes are going to be made onto my directory or into my folder here, once this thing makes the actual change and copies the file, we will be able to go and commit them. So while we're waiting, it's probably a good time for us to discuss. Let's take a look at the file content that was created inside the custom package. Okay, it just moved them. All right, and here are all my files. Okay, so let's take a look at all these files that are created as part of the package. So we'll see a lot of JSON files describing things, describing schemas, and some resource files that you may have never looked at before. So all your localizable values and strings in multiple languages are getting created, as well as JavaScript files for your episode pages, right? So that's our page, and the section files are being created, and things like this. And you could tell that what's happening here is you've got a red line and a green line. Red line indicating that a line was removed, and the green line indicating that a line was added. Now, this is how Git works. It works on the premise of delete old, add new. So it doesn't do update. So when it needs to update, it just deletes and adds. And it's got a very sophisticated algorithm how it figures out what needs to be removed and added, but nonetheless, it removes and adds. So you can always represent it with two colors. So red is something that's being removed, and green is something that's being added. Now, in here, you could see the amount of files that was generated and that was added. And so now when we have saved them all, now we need to commit it back into our basically GitHub repository. Now we can still go here and inside of particular file, and we can make whatever changes we want. Well, not here, but inside the actual content of the folder. So if we're going to go into schemas under our episode, you could see that schemas have now been moved. Okay, so we can go into this episode 13. We can rename things. So for example, I'd like to rename this field from USR name with the GUID to just USR name. I can save this and I can commit it. Now, if I want to commit something, Control-Shift-P, git commit. Okay, and you can say commit all. Now, what are we going to commit? We're going to provide a message, and the message we're going to write is going to be added new section. Okay, there we go. I need to choose the package. Added new section. And now all my changes are committed. So we can take a look at the changes. So it's figuring out all these changes. Now all the changes are gone. And now we can just simply click on this button or just simply say git push to push our changes. And now my changes are being pushed onto the remote storage. So this way you can use Creatio to essentially help you create all the necessary directories, all the necessary files, make the necessary changes, and then load that into your remote repository. So now if we're going to go back into our episode 3, we will see inside the directory, let's say inside schemas. Okay, so now we see that we have added a bunch of schemas here, a bunch of resource files, a bunch of localizable strings, and things like this. The same thing will happen if we're going to go and we're going to create things like business process or case management or lookup values. All we have to do is we have to go inside creation. We have to say, okay, just save the file. It's going to save it on disk. And on occasion, what you may want to do is before you're ready to commit is you need to click Actions, Download Packages to File System, just to make sure that you flush everything from the system, especially if you're working with things such as localizable values, if you're working with the data storage. So let's say if you want to add some values in your data, just by clicking Add Data, okay, you just want to make sure that you click on Actions, Download everything to file system. So if you download packages to file system, system will try to figure out if there's anything to be downloaded onto disk that does not exist on disk, and if there is, it will download, and if there isn't, it will not. Now, can we do, I see a Ram is asking a question, whether or not we can do this for cloud-hosted applications. Like I said in the beginning, Git only works with the content of your disk. It only works with stuff that you have I/O access to. cloud does not provide you I/O access. So no, there is no way for you to directly connect Git. There is, however, a way to download a package from a remote cloud repository with the help of Clio. So just take a look at the Clio download command. That will create a directory on your local disk that you will then be able to commit into some remote Git repository, but you're still missing out on the great many benefits of converting your application in development and file system mode, which is the debugging, right? So this is probably the main one. Now, if you're only using, let's say, if you're only writing JavaScript and there is no need for you to, let's say, debug, and you can debug in the browser, then yes, you can take this approach where you download something off a remote host, modify it locally, or commit it to Git. Yeah, you can do that, but you will not be able to install directly from Git. So now let's take a look at how you may go about downloading items of Git. Now, previously, what I did is I used the command wget to download a particular file from Git. So everything that we've committed on the GitHub, let's take a look at our GitHub. So everything we've committed here will have its own URL that we can, let's say, if we want to just grab a particular JavaScript file. So let's go ahead and find one. So page 1 will definitely have a JS file. So if I just want this JS file, I can click on raw, and from raw, I can just go ahead and download this file. I can use curl or wget or whatever and just download content of this directory. But what if I want to download the entire thing? How do I go about it? Well, the way you go about it is just by saying git clone. And so I accidentally closed this. Accidentally closed my repository. So let me go into my profile and into my organization and into episode 3. Okay, so when you navigate for the first time onto a Git repository, you probably want to download it. Now, how do you download? Well, there is this green button that tells you to download things, and you just simply click on code and you say download it, right? So download zip file. There we go. And this zip file will essentially contain everything that this repository contains. If we open the zip file, you'll see that here's my branch, and I may have multiple branches here. If I go inside, here's my episode 3, and here's my file. Here's my entire package. Now, there is a better way of getting it if you already have Git installed, and that just you copy this URL, and let me open a command prompt. Okay, and let me just go in the C drive, and let's make a directory test EP3. Okay, and let's go inside test. Oops, I apparently have many tests. Test EP3. Okay, let's just go there. And as you can see, the directory is totally empty. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do this: git clone and paste this URL, and essentially hit enter. And now what's happened is that Git cloned this repository. If I do ls on it, I can do inside episode 3, and I can ls it, and I can see that. And let's do an episode 3 one more time. And let's ls. Okay, and here's my package. So I essentially downloaded the entire content of this package. Now, the other thing that you may want to do is when you're providing a solution to, let's say, your customer, and the customer says, well, give me the source code. Okay, great. But the customer may still need to maybe build it as it may have some binaries there. And if you don't want that hassle for the customer, what you want to do is you want to create perhaps a release. When you create a release, that means that it's my final. Okay, so the stuff that you see before, the stuff that you saw before in code, this is the code. But in the release, it's the final build project. So the way you may want to approach it is, let's say you're going to go into episode 3 and you're going to say, let's export this package right now. Okay, so the system is going to think a little bit, or you can even use Git to help you with the release, to help you create this package. And here's my download file. So why don't we just show it in the folder? Okay, and I'm going to change this to just episode 3. Okay. And that's my zip file. And let's go back into our release folder and let's upload this. Let's upload this file, and we're gonna go, where is it? Downloads, episode 3. Now, you upload this file, and we're gonna say release title, pre-prod pre-prod release, tag version. Let's say we're not ready to go live, so it's 001, it's just the main one. You can also describe, so basic features, only sections included. Okay, so some sort of a description here. We can also say that this is a pre-release to make it even more obvious to people if you so choose, and you can publish this release. Now what's going to happen is the person will be able to download your source code in zip file, okay, or they will be able to download the release itself. So let's go back into episode 3. Into episode 3, and what you will see is that there is one release. Okay, so there is one release tag, and the user, if you direct them to this page, they will be able to go ahead and take a look at this particular release, and they will be able to find the assets and download this episode 3 zip. So all you need to do is you need to point them to this URL, and this is the URL. Once they download the zip file, they can go into their cloud environment and simply install it with the common install application from file approach. Okay, so this is the basics of working with Git. So again, Git is something that allows us to commit files that already exist in our disk, and they can be any files, XML, SVGs, C#, JavaScript, does not matter. It allows us to take the content of a directory and essentially commit it into a remote repository. Now, Git provides us with quite a lot more in terms of features, but there's so many, it's impossible to cover it all in one shot. But if you're looking to start with Git, just try out these first ones and learn about the different files that system is creating for us. And that's about it. All right, guys, so this is it for today. So thank you very much for spending about 1 hour with me today. And please do join me next week, where hopefully we can take this Git session a little bit further and give you a little bit more information about what to do with your code once the code is built. Anyway, looking forward to seeing you next week. Thank you.